Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives, our jobs, our debts, our incomes, those of our children, and those looming down the road. And boy, are they looming after the United States Senate passed an absolutely remarkable tax bill this last few weeks, if indeed it took that many weeks. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and that in a way has prepared me to provide these economic updates to cover the events of the recent past and put them in some sort of perspective. I want to begin with a struggle going on in the United Kingdom. It pits, on the one hand, one of the largest banks in the world, Morgan Stanley, based in New York, but a global bank, like the monster banks of today usually are, and an up-and-coming political leader in Great Britain named Jeremy Corbyn. This struggle has been unfolding for a while, but really hit fever pitch a few weeks ago, and the ramifications are still gurgling around, which is why I want to talk to you about them. Here's how it began. Morgan Stanley sends communications to its banking clients and recently sent a communication saying that people should not just be very worried about Brexit, that's the process by which Britain is leaving the European Union that it was part of, that people know all about, but that the clients of the bank should be just as worried because an equivalent risk is posed by a government led by the Labour Party, whose leader is Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Corbyn did not wait very long to respond, and he reacted by reminding the people of Britain what he thought, and indeed what many of them think, of Morgan Stanley. Let me quote Mr. Corbyn to you. Quote, "Speculators and gamblers who crashed our economy in 2008. He continues with the following quote, "Nurses, teachers, shop workers, builders, just about everyone is finding it harder to get by while Morgan Stanley's CEO paid himself £21.5 million last year. It'd be more than that in dollars. And UK banks paid out £15 billion in bonuses." "You are right to feel threatened," Mr. Corbyn told the bank. "We are going to change things. You are not going to be taking advantage of the British people in the future the way you have with the Conservatives in the past." That was his message. I find it remarkable for two reasons. One, we don't see that from the opposition in the United States. The Democratic Party's leaders, with the exception of Bernie Sanders, have been notably quiet when it comes to criticizing the banks, and never in language even vaguely like Mr. Corbyn's. But there's a second issue here that's even more important. The conventional excuse given by politicians as to why they don't criticize the banks, for example, in the manner of Mr. Corbyn, has been the following. If we were to criticize them, and even more if we were to tax them what we ought to, regulate them as we ought to, why then they'll just leave and we'll all be worse off. What a convenient excuse. I would guess it was written in the boardroom of a bank by a hired PR executive. Why? Because the threat is phony and empty. And let me explain why. In a game of threats between a bank and a country, it's the bank that has to worry. Let's suppose a government passes a tax on a bank. And let's suppose it's the American government and the bank is Morgan Stanley, an American-based bank, and it were actually to proceed to leave. Does that mean the government has no counter threat? That the government has no steps it can take, either to prevent or to punish a bank that leaves the country to evade a legally imposed tax? And the answer is, of course, it has weapons. Imagine a president who went to the people and the businesses of America and said, I suggest you don't patronize a bank that behaves in this asocial way. Imagine a president or a Congress which began to look into all the things that bank has been and is currently doing to ascertain where, when, and how it violates the law with an attentiveness you don't normally see. Does the bank really wish to engage these kinds of risks? Might a government decide not to do business with any company that is in turn doing business with a bank that behaves that way? The American government has done that before to other entities around the world. Why stop there? In other words, a bank that threatens the government when the government is doing its legally entitled taxing and regulating activities, a bank that threatens to leave can and should provoke in a government counter threats, counter steps. That's what Mr. Corbyn is suggesting. It's a mystery to me, but not really, why American politicians can't and won't say things like this, which would level the playing field and stop leading our politicians to be such easy pushovers for lame, empty excuses to allow the super rich to continue to get their favoritism. My next update is about inequality in the United States. Well, I'm not going to go over the statistics. I've done that in earlier programs, and I assume many of you know how grossly unequal the income and wealth distributions of the United States have become. The extraordinary wealth of the top 5 or 10%, and the economic difficulties surrounding everybody else. But I wanted to bring to your attention one of the consequences of this kind of inequality. It leads businesses to go where the money is. That is, businesses that serve your average person, your poor or working class or middle person, those are the businesses that are having trouble. As in the 6,500 malls that will close in 2017 because they can't sell enough stuff. But of course, the capital that is not invested anymore in producing for the mass of people who can't buy is now finding profit by producing for the tiny number who can. Here are 3 examples I've found to bring to your attention. The 2019 Corvette ZR1 convertible. Don't get too excited, but let me tell you about it. It has a 755 horsepower LT5 6.2-liter supercharged engine. For those of you that are planning to do the kind of driving that requires 755 horsepower. But there it is. I wanted you to know about it. And the ZR1 convertible will start at $123,995. They will both be going on sale in the spring of 2018. Can you wait? The next automobile that caught my attention when I got on a roll with this was the Land Rover. This is the 218 Range Rover SV Autobiography SUV. It's getting be a real mouthful to describe these cars. Well, this one comes with a 557 horsepower supercharged V8 engine, and it starts at just under $210,000 for this little item. And the last one, for those of you with a charming Christmas present perhaps on your mind, the Porsche Panamera Turbo SE Hybrid is the world's most powerful luxury sedan. How do I know that? Because they say so. This hatchback sedan gets 680 total horsepower, more than the 911 GT3 and the Cayenne Turbo SUV. I hope these letters mean something to you. They don't to me. I'm just reading it off. $188,000 will get you that one. Some people have it, and then the rest of us read about it. Then my eyes were caught by yet another milestone. The New York Times, which is read around the world as what we call the newspaper of record for the United States, sort of like the Le Monde is in France, or Die Zeit in Germany, or Toronto Globe and Mail in Canada, and so on. The kind of the newspaper that kind of represents the country. So when a newspaper with that kind of a position makes a big step, it's worth talking about. What's the step that the New York Times recently took? It's going to cut access, electronic access through the internet, to stories in the newspaper, free access, from 10 stories a month to 5. If you want to read more than 5 stories a month in this daily newspaper, you will have to pay. In other words, the distribution of the news from the newspaper of record of the United States of America is going to be cut back to interested people around the world in order for the newspaper company to make more money. If you needed an example of the subordination of the distribution of information, which is the only way a community can govern itself in a rational way, the subordination of information distribution to profit, there it is. Think about it. The next update has to do with Mr. Jerome Powell. He is the new head of the Federal Reserve, the institution of the United States government whose job is to manage the monetary system, to control the quantity of money in circulation, at least as far as it can, to shape the pattern of interest rates, and thereby to shape the economic life of the United States. He said something so astonishing the other day that I want to report it to you and compare it to something said by a predecessor head of the Federal Reserve, whose name you may remember, Ben Bernanke by name, who was the head of the Fed for quite a few years before Janet Yellen took that position. Here's what Mr. Powell, the new head of the Fed, said that caught my attention. We no longer have here in the United States, he said, any banks that are, quote, too big to fail. Let me remind you that in the collapse of the American banking system in 2008, the lead into the catastrophe was taken by the biggest banks in the United States, who went to the federal government. I'm talking about Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citibank, Morgan Stanley. You know them. Their names are well known. These banks went to the government, particularly in the last 4 months of 2008, and basically made the following argument. We are bankrupt. We are about to fail, which means we are about to tell the depositors who've put their money in our bank, individuals and businesses alike, that we can't give them access to their money because we don't have it anymore. We invested it and loaned it in ways we cannot recover. And if we declare bankruptcy, all of these individuals and all of these businesses will in turn, by not having access to their money, be unable to pay their bills, plunging everybody they owe money to into the same catastrophe. You, the government, said these bankers, can't let this happen. Why? Because we, the bankers said, are too big to fail. If you let us fail, we'll take the whole system down with us. Talk about threats. And dutifully, the Department of the Treasury and the government and the Federal Reserve at that time caved in and bailed them all out. Since that time, most of those banks, get ready now, have gotten bigger than they were then. But the new head of the Federal Reserve isn't worried at all. In his judgment, we don't have banks anymore that are too big to fail. If you believe that, friends and neighbors, then let me remind you of a famous statement made by the then head of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke. In May 2007, that's just before the capitalist system crashed, led by the banks, Mr. Bernanke publicly made the following statement, quote, "We do not expect significant spillovers from the subprime market to the rest of the economy or to the financial system." In May 2007, to remind you, millions of Americans were unable to cover their mortgage payments, which plunged millions of banks into trouble because they had made these mortgage loans to these Americans. And there was Mr. Bernanke explaining to anyone who would listen, yes, it's unfortunate for the mortgage market, it's unfortunate for those people, it's unfortunate for the banks who lend to them, but, let me quote again, "We do not expect significant spillovers from the subprime market to the rest of the economy." He was as wrong can be. And that's the case with Mr. Powell, likely, too. Before moving on, let me remind you that we maintain two websites that are full of information and capabilities that I think will interest you. The first is rdwolf with 2fs.com, and the second is democracyatwork.info. That's all one word, democracyatwork.info. These two websites allow you to communicate to us what you like and don't like about the program, what you would like us to cover. These two websites allow you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. They provide information, linkages, and a blog that you may find interesting. Material that we upload every day to expand the reach of the work we do, but also to enable you to be partners with us, for you to make use of this information in your conversations with friends, neighbors, relatives, co-workers. We want to reach as many people as possible, and partnering with you by means of these websites is a way for us to do that. And for those of you that are listening on the radio, if you would like to see this program as a television program, there's an easy way for you to do that. Visit patreon.com, Patreon, patreon.com/economic update, the name of the program, and you can watch this program on television in that way. Returning to our economic updates, I was struck by another act of Congress recently. You know, businesses have been trying, and successfully for many years, to prevent the people they harm with a bad product, with a misleading advertisement, in any of the ways that business harms the public and its customers, it used to be possible for individuals to begin a lawsuit to compensate themselves for the damage they've suffered, and to make that something called a class action suit, a legal form in which all the people who are victimized by a company can together sue for compensation and to get the company to stop this behavior. Companies didn't like that, surprise, surprise. So they developed a very interesting gambit. In tiny print towards the end of contracts and public relations about what they do, they carry a little demand that anybody with a complaint about something they've done cannot go the route of a class action suit, has to go to binding arbitration. That requires individuals to pay the high costs of a lawyer to fight it out in an arbitration, and allows the company, with its deep pockets, to have a much more expensive law firm, and you can see what's going on here. And there had been action by aggrieved public and aggrieved customers to get a law that prevents companies from being able to get around the legal resource and recourse that people have. And a law had been passed. But with a new Congress and the power of the money that buys particularly Republicans, but Democrats too in the main, the Congress undid that law. So now companies are free to require binding arbitration, which vast numbers of people cannot and will not afford, and not the success that class action suits always, or at least often, had. This leads to a general understanding. Regulating capitalism is a thankless, long-term failure as a strategy. Why? Because the people who are aggrieved by the behavior of corporations, particularly big ones, who get a regulation, don't understand that the minute that regulation is passed, after momentous opposition by the companies, they then go to work to undo the regulation, to amend it, to change it, and they have the money and they have the incentive to keep at it in the way that the aggrieved public doesn't. It's an unfair setup. It's only then a matter of time before the regulation is eviscerated, destroyed, the abusive behavior by the company resumes, the victimization of the public, of the employees, of the customers becomes so outrageous that they rise up and, oh no, pass another regulation. And that repeats the whole game. Eventually people have to learn the problem is the system. Regulating it doesn't solve that problem. So long as we let businesses that do the production of the goods and services we need be run by people whose first priority, whose bottom line is their profit, whenever there's a clash between that and what we the public or we the employees need, you know as well as I do what gets sacrificed and what gets the priority. Regulation can't solve the problem. The last update we have time for comes from Italy, and indeed from Sicily, the southernmost part of Italy, and has to do with oil companies and something they have done for years. In this case, the oil company is Eni. It's the largest oil company in Italy, and it has run an oil refinery in Gela, G-E-L-A, in Sicily, for 54 years. For the last 10 years, there's been a battle between the government of Sicily and Eni. Why? Because it turns out that the Eni oil company dumped huge amounts of toxic waste in a 3-mile-long undersea dump off Sicily, close to Gela, where hundreds of people over the last decades have had an unusual kind of illness, actually a set of different illnesses, trying every which way to figure out what it was, where it came from. And they have now persuaded scientists and others to look into it, with the result that I'm reporting to you. The problem is that secretly, unknown to the people there, for decades, an oil company dumped toxic waste under the water off of Sicily. When you hear about these stories, please remember one key fact, whatever other horror this brings up when you imagine what's going on. This company did what companies in general do. It was stuck with a toxic byproduct of whatever it was producing, in this case, oil. Now it had to do something with this toxic byproduct. It could have tried all manner of chemical and other procedures to make it not toxic. Failing that, it could have tried to find safe places far away from human beings to encase this toxic material so it doesn't hurt anybody. Those kinds of efforts are expensive over long periods of time, if you can even find them. They didn't want to spend the money. They wanted to be more profitable, and had they spent the money, it would have increased their costs. The people running this oil company are not monsters. They're not all that different from you and me. They're not the problem. A system that works this way is. Imagine an oil company run by the people who are its customers, who need the oil to run their vehicles, to heat their homes, to run their businesses. Suppose the workers and the customers together ran such a business. Would they have made themselves sick in this way, or might they have found a better way? If you answer a better way, you've become a critic of capitalism too. Thanks for paying attention. Please stay with us. We will be back after a very short intermission.